Well, it's St. Francis Sunday today, and there's one thing I want you to remember and know about St. Francis. Francis was a fool. You heard me right. He was a fool. And he said it himself, so I am allowed to speak ill of him. Francis was fool enough to believe that people should actually do the things that Jesus told them to do. That we should actually live our lives like Jesus wanted us to live. Jesus says, "Sell what you own, give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." Well, for those of you who didn't know, Francis grew up incredibly wealthy. He was the son of a very rich cloth merchant. He lacked for nothing, wanted for nothing, and his parents gave him anything that he could desire. He grew up having a carefree childhood and youth and adolescence, and just went off partying and gallivanting around with not a care in the world, until he had a spiritual awakening. He changed his life and decided that all of a sudden everything that he had been doing meant nothing. He denounced his father and his father's wealth, gave it all up, and traveled around preaching and teaching and sharing peace and faith, relying on the hospitality of others and not on himself. Sounds like someone we know. Jesus says, "Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you." Well, Francis wasn't the only one who called himself a fool. Just about everyone else did too. We might think today of Francis and we venerate him, and he is one of, if not the most popular saint. This morning someone corrected me and said St. Nicholas is probably more popular. I conceded, but Francis is right up there with St. Nick. And aside from being called crazy in his day, right to his face, Francis would, it said, go and travel across enemy lines during the Fifth Crusade, where he attempted to convert the Muslim sultan there to Christianity, or at the very least, obtain peace. Now, we don't know the exact result of these conversations or this journey of his. There's many speculation and lots written about it. But what everyone seems to agree is that he made the attempt. He wasn't afraid to face rejection or death. And he was also unwilling to condemn those who didn't do the life or live the life that he lived. He didn't condemn the rich and the wealthy if they refused to also give up their wealth and travel around like nomads. He didn't condemn them for doing what they thought was right, even if he knew and believed it was wrong. Even when the people around him, walking the streets, begged him to call them out and shame them. What he did was continue to preach. He continued to challenge those rich and wealthy people to give and to give more, but he refused to condemn. Today, in our gospel, Jesus says, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants." Well, Francis himself was one of these infants. He was not an intellectual. He hadn't spent his childhood immersed in studies, religious or otherwise. And he didn't even use his wealth when he had it to obtain some political prowess or power. And so, when he heard God's call on his life, he didn't have those years of education or hard-earned anything that convinced him otherwise. It was easy for Francis to give it all up and turn and follow God, to live as Jesus lived. So often, it's all of the things that we have accumulated, knowledge and wealth and status, sometimes even relationships, that keep us from living the lives we're called to live. And the older we get, we know this, the more complicated life gets, and the easier it is to start making excuses or getting confused about what is right and what is wrong. I hear all of this today, and I can't help but think about Greta Thunberg. Have you heard of her? If you hadn't, aside from today, you're sure to very soon, because she is taking the world by storm. Greta is a 16-year-old Swedish girl with Asperger's syndrome, and she has dedicated her life, her passion, to raising awareness around the world for environmental issues, for climate control, for making the world what it needs to be. It started out with a solo climate protest from her school. She was the only one. And somehow people heard about this and started joining in, and within months since then, she has been joined by tens of thousands of school and university students who have participated in climate strikes in more than a dozen countries. And just this past September, Greta and the youth in her movement decided it was time to get some adults on board. And they asked for the adults to join them in a global climate strike that had at least 4 million people in participation. She's spoken to the UN, the US Congress, the business elite in Davos, Switzerland, and she doesn't seem to have any plans on stopping. Now, there are many who criticize her, who want to believe that how we treat the planet in our care doesn't matter. But her biggest criticisms are not even about what she's saying, the science that she is quoting and citing and producing, but they're about her age. She's too young. She should let the adults talk. Or, much more disgustingly, they criticize her Asperger's and her age. And we hear comments about how she's just a mentally ill child. Greta takes it all in stride. She does not turn around with pithy quips or attacks and goes under the belt. She simply states her beliefs and does it without shame. She responds and says, "I don't care about age, nor do I care about those who do not accept the science. I don't have as much experience, and therefore I listen more. But I also have the right to express my opinion, no matter my age. Being young is a great advantage, since we see the world from a new perspective, and we are not afraid to make radical changes." What was it our gospel said again? That God reveals himself to infants? Well, today is St. Francis Sunday. Today, we remember that Francis himself started out as an infant. So no matter where each of us is on our faith journey, it is never too late to hear God's call. And it's certainly never too late to respond. We remember that sometimes the most educated and important people are also the most in the dark, and that we need to listen to the wisdom of children like Greta and fools like Francis. People who listen more, learn more, seek to make changes that many of us are afraid to make. Yeah, Francis was a fool, but I hope that I am one too. I hope that I can be as passionate as he was, as Greta is, about caring for God's creation. I hope that I, too, can be fool enough to believe that the world can show compassion for the poor and the sick and the needy. That all of us can treat animals not as playthings or as tools to serve our needs, but as beings in need of nurture. That we can each honor the world that we've been gifted and not suck its resources dry and pollute it for our own gain. Some might say, you're a fool if you believe all of that. I say, I hope I am.